I'm very, very happy and honored to be here, and my topic tonight is parent advocacy, the sleeping giant of Catholic education. What I want to begin with is kind of an overview of the context and basically how we got here. So the larger historical context of sleepiness. What are some of the historical, sociological trends that brought us to the point right now where Catholic schools are? And I think it's important to take a look at this history. Now, when I share some of this information, I'm not doing it through rose-colored glasses and saying, oh, great, how wonderful it was 34 years ago. I'm also not saying how bad it was 34 years ago. I found a lot of times audiences view that as a Rorschach pattern. If they thought it was bad back then, they'll think that I'm saying that it's bad, and if they thought it was good, they'll think that I'm saying that it's good. I'm not making either judgment about that. I'm just laying the historical antecedents that kind of brought us to this point. I'm also going to talk to you about my 12 assumptions of parent advocacy, and I'm going to lay these out in kind of sequential form, and hopefully as assumptions you will give your nodding assent to this, and then you'll see how this progresses, that if these are true, there are certain things that we need to take advantage of and do to really get us to a point where we don't have that sleepiness anymore. The other thing I'm going to do is share with you a case study, and this actually goes to my own parish. As I'm going to get into this and the introduction articulated, I've been a classroom teacher in a Catholic school, a science department chairman, principal, as well as a president, superintendent, and now I'm a Catholic school parent of 4 kids. I also served on the school board. So when I was on the school board, I definitely wanted to make a significant difference. And so the case study that I'm going to share with you is something that I did at Holy Redeemer in Webster Groves, Missouri. And I'll talk about some of the consequences of that and some of the unforeseen consequences of that generated a lot of really good things. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some practical steps that can be taken to mobilize parents to political action. And then I'm going to close with this concept of the universal call to holiness, which is something that Vatican II called all of us, the laity, to take charge of, but I think in a very particular way is important for we as parents to take that on. And again, part of the introduction, not only am I an academic, a professor at St. Louis University teaching educational administration to Catholic school administrators, not only am I a former Catholic school teacher, principal, president, superintendent, but I'm also a Catholic school parent. So these are my 4 kids. Ben in 8th grade, Rachel 6th, Matthew in 4th, and Peter in 1st. And this is at our parish school, Holy Redeemer in Webster Grove. So hopefully I'll get some street credibility here with the parents now too. Got to establish that up front. What I want to begin with is talking about some of the large changes that have happened in the last 50 years. And sometimes we really have to take a step back to figure out how fundamentally changed our society is from 50 years ago. And I'm going to focus in on a couple of key points. First and foremost, the suburban flight from the urban center or the urban ghettos. If we go back 50 years, most major metropolitan areas had their little Irish enclave, their Italian enclave, their Polish enclave. In fact, there might have been 2 parish Polish enclaves, the Warsaw one and the Krakow one, and they didn't even want to talk to one another because even though they were both Polish, they were from different parts of the country. That kind of was our history, and throughout much of the country, as you all know here on the East Coast, when Catholics arrived, we were a persecuted minority. And even throughout the 20th century, the 19th and 20th century, as the immigrants came on in there, we settled into our little ethnic enclaves. Something very, very fundamentally, a change happened. With World War II, the GI Bill, Catholics experienced this upward mobility. The Eisenhower interstate system came in, and all of a sudden the suburbs were possible. And so what happened is lots of people then moved out to the suburb, and we had this massive exodus of people moving out to the suburbs. One of the unintended or unforeseen consequences of that is now these nice little parish enclaves, which were the center of life. And I think if you go back in the Midwest, you'll see some of the parishes that have bowling alleys in the basement. They have bars in the basement. It was the full-service parish doing everything for everybody. Every kind of human interaction you'd need, the parish provided. But as we moved out to the suburbs, the parishes had to be built very quickly, and they were no longer this center of life. They were not the full-service entities that they were in the past. There are also obviously large, massive sociological changes that happened from the 1950s to the present. I'm going to just highlight a few of them in terms of cultural, sociological studies that impact the Catholic population, but we all know many of the sweeping sociological changes that have happened there. The other one I referred to a little bit earlier is the removal of the parish as the center focal point. I alluded to the bowling alleys, the bars, the parish really being the focal point of all social and cultural events. Now, if I were to play pocket sociologist, I'd probably have to say, at least in Missouri, the center focal point of the family is probably the select soccer team. The select soccer team is the axis around the entire family life, that you will rearrange and restructure dinner and family holidays and events and Sunday and everything for our select soccer. And different communities have their different things that are the focal point. And then, of course, the diminished impact of formal catechesis and religion in general. Just a couple of data points to really kind of pin this on. Harris did a study of some of the migrations that were happening, particularly within the Catholic population. And if you take a look at the city of Cleveland, in 1950, between 1950 and 1990, Cleveland, the city, lost over 400,000 people. They moved out of the city. In that same time, the surrounding Cuyahoga County increased by over 400,000. So that is a mass exodus of people, close to 500,000 people making that move. We also see this demographic showing up in terms of the size of the parishes. If we take a look at the parishes in the city of Cleveland, the number of parishioners in 1950 was about 2,600 in the city and 2,400 in the county. If we jump forward to 1990, that had changed to 1,666 in the city and 5,617 in the county. So what you see here is a massive ballooning of the parishes out in the suburbs and the county, and a dramatic shrinkage of those parishes in the city. Cleveland is just an example, but I think you'll see this phenomena echoing itself throughout many, many metro areas. Along with this migration to the suburbs, a number of the episcopacy recognize this. In fact, we have here a quote from Cardinal Stritz: "The city of Chicago is emptying out into the suburbs. Thousands and thousands are going into the little homes in the suburban areas. New parishes are needed, new schools are needed, and of course, new priests are needed." An interesting little tidbit from Gallup, the Gallup organization that does national polls, and I think this is where you can really see the dramatic drop of the influence in religion in America. Did a question both in 1957 and 1968, asking, at the present time, do you think that religion as a whole is increasing its influence on American life or losing its influence? Notice within that 11-year period, a complete flip-flop. In 1957, close to 70% of the American population were saying that religion is increasing its influence in the larger society. Just 11 years later, 1968, we had only 18%. Decreasing was 67%. So just an amazing fundamental sociological change just in those 11 years. So what was going on in those 11 years? A picture says 1,000 words. If we take a look at the Gallup organization, and they went through the responses, their response was as follows. Those answering losing usually cited one of four reasons. Young people are losing interest in formal religion, growing immorality and violence, materialism. The church is not playing its proper role, those being equally divided between those who said the church was not keeping up with the times and those who thought the church too involved in social and political issues. So again, we start to see the beginning of a huge political and sociological divide within the church. Another unfortunate thing happened. This was also when we had a tremendous loss of religious and a tremendous influx in lay teachers, and also the baby boom was coming, so we were still building lots of Catholic schools, but we were running into problems staffing them. And one of the decisions made by Cardinal Ritter in St. Louis, who was not alone in this, wanted to stop the construction of all Catholic schools until they had 3 religious for every 1 layperson, and wanted to diminish the class sizes to fewer than 49 students per classroom. Okay? So the concern there was we just don't have enough staff to teach all these kids, and we certainly don't have enough religious. And so while this massive exodus was going on, we weren't building Catholic schools and we weren't staffing them. Okay? We were kind of a victim of our own success at this point in time. This did not catch American Catholic sociologists off guard. Andrew Greeley, the noted American Catholic sociologist, pointed out, somehow by a process not yet clear to me, the decision was made by bishops and priests that no more new Catholic schools were to be built and that CCT was to become the de facto substitute for schools. He goes on to say, which I think is interesting, this was said in 1975, is probably still true to a certain extent today. Changes in the administration and financing of Catholic education would be absolutely imperative to making such funds available, but there is so much caution and fear and mediocrity in the leadership of the American Church that it seems much easier to close schools down or to refuse to build new ones than to risk innovative techniques of administering and funding Catholic schools. Now again, I don't mean to be bashing the episcopacy, and let me just tell you a little aside. I've given a similar presentation to this at the Missouri Catholic Conference, and I had in my audience my 4 bishops. And as a matter of fact, our parish, Holy Redeemer, we've been kind of the kingmaker recently. We've had 2 bishops who have been in residence that are just recently named, and I was a little nervous when I was coming up to these slides, but then I looked over to my ordinary and he was doing this. So I felt a little better about that. Another little interesting study was a national study of Catholic schools in the area of public relations. This was done in 1965. Now, for the Catholic educators, this is going to be a notable year because this was the peak enrollment for us. So kind of a window into public relations at the time in 1965 is kind of an interesting historical anecdote. The title of the study was Nowhere to Go But Up. Doesn't sound too good, does it? One of the findings of the public relations study was that, for the most part, Catholic schools are doing okay, but their public relations is just horrible. In fact, in a number of schools, the researchers found out that the typical situation is a school run by a religious who was not trained for the position, resented being in the position, was preparing students for eternity, not the present, didn't care what the community thought, was busy running an understaffed school, and didn't feel the need to cooperate in stories about the school. Interestingly enough, and I think Bert will appreciate this one, there was also a question about what they thought of what was coming out of the Archdiocese Central Office, and the principals a lot of times had some very disparaging words for the Central Office. That was back in 1965, Bert. I'm sure things have changed dramatically since then. So this is kind of the context in 1965. We've got Catholic schools that were originally built as a bulwark against a larger hostile culture, to try to prepare immigrant, ignorant populations to kind of move into the American mainstream. And unfortunately, or fortunately, they were very, very successful. Catholics moved very much into the mainstream. The GI Bill moved into affluence, moved out to the suburbs, and no longer needed the Catholic school. At least that was the thinking in 1965 when Mary Perkins Ryan published a book entitled Are Catholic Schools the Answer? And her answer was a definitive no. She said that Catholic schools were the pejorative in a very, very negative sense, or they were not needed in a pejorative sense. They were parochial in the pejorative sense, were not needed anymore, and actually prevented the church from really reaching its evangelical mission. It caused quite a stir in the church. I think some of you probably remember Mary Perkins Ryan, a book on that regard. And between 1965 and 1975, we did see a precipitous drop in Catholic school enrollment. In 1975, the bishops noticed this, and they decided to go ahead and commission a study because they noticed all these Catholic kids were no longer in Catholic schools. So the question is, where are they? The title of the study is, Where Are the 6.6 Million Kids? Those were the people that were unaccounted for, either in Catholic schools or CCD. And this graphic shows basically the difference between 1965 and 1974. In 1965, we had roughly 46.5% of all K through 8 Catholic or kids in Catholic schools, 36.1% in CCD, and only 17.4% were uncatechized or unchurched. If we fast forward to 1974 elementary students, now we're up to 36.5% of the elementary students receiving no formal catechesis. Only 26% of the kids in Catholic schools, 40% in CCD. The numbers get even worse up in the secondary school. In 1965, 28% of Catholic kids in Catholic schools. By 1975, 17.6%. Down at the bottom, secondary school, 61.4% of high school age Catholics not receiving any kind of formal catechetical training, either Catholic school or CCD. Now this is kind of an interesting little historical antecedent, except for the fact that these are now your parents. I was in Holy Cross grade school in the 1970s. I was born in 1967, so I started Catholic schools in 72, and I was going through Catholic schools in the 1970s. So I've got 4 kids in Catholic schools, so these are your parents. Many of them having not received any kind of formal religious education either in Catholic school or CCD. So that's something to keep in the back of your head as we move on forward.